students make progress. So really what we're going to be talking about over the next hour is ways to support sensory needs of students. There's really often a thought that only certain types of individuals have sensory needs or need sensory support. But really the truth is that all of us seek out sensory input, or we avoid certain types of sensory input. And we often do this without really giving it a lot of thought. But there are some kiddos who do need systematic sensory support. And as we're going into the summer, there may be some things that you're thinking about for your kiddos, and hopefully there'll be some tips and ideas here that will help you. I think, as Misty said at the beginning, if you have a general question, feel free to drop it in the chat, and Misty or Sarah, you both can interrupt me at any time. But if you have a more specific question, we'll wait to the end so that we can turn off the recording, and then I'm happy to stay on the Zoom as long as anybody needs that. I know it's always challenging to interact via Zoom, so feel free to pop in as you need to. We know in order for kids to be successful in school, they have to be able to regulate their sensory system. The sensory system impacts every aspect of our functioning, our academic learning, behavioral and emotional regulation, and attention. But it's really important to remember that today, what I'm going to be talking about are just very general strategies. So some of your children may have more specialized needs. And so it goes without saying to please, please, please communicate closely with your child's teachers, with other school personnel, as well as your child's physician. If you have concerns specifically about your child and maybe the need for more specialized support. And just like everything that we're going to talk about today and anything that you try with your own child, guidelines and boundaries are always essential for any strategy to be effective. But before we can talk about sensory responses and sensory strategies, I want to be on the same page about the sensory system. So most of us are very well aware of the 5 basic systems, but we actually have 8 sensory systems. So I'm going to go through each of them very briefly. Know this is just sort of scratching the surface, and all of these sensory systems overlap and interact with one another as we go throughout our days and our activities. So the ones that we're well aware of, our visual sensory system, or that sight, that's really using our eyes to see what's far and what's close up. Neurotypically developing people, they're able to use sort of smooth and precise eye movements to scan and visually assess the entire environment. So if you have dysregulation in that visual system, it's hard to integrate all of the things that you're seeing around you into one cohesive picture. And then we've got our auditory or our hearing system. And that not only includes just what we hear, but also being able to listen, also being able to filter, and then selectively attend to auditory stimuli. So in the classroom, what that looks like is being able to filter out other students while being able to listen to the teacher. At home, that might be filtering out your siblings while trying to listen to mom and dad talk. We've got our tactile system or our touch system. Now, this is going to be often the most commonly recognized sensory system of the body. The one that generally, if there's a problem, whether a child is overreactive or underreactive, that's the one we're going to notice the most, because that tactile system is how we process information through our skin. And some of the areas of our skin are more sensitive to tactile input than others. So generally, our mouth and hands are going to be more sensitive. And that's often why you see younger children explore things by touching them, by putting them into their mouths, because they're trying to get that tactile input. And that tactile sensory system is really important for not only identifying touch, but identifying pressure, for identifying pain and temperature. So things that we need to help keep us safe. And then we've got our taste and our smell, or our gustatory and our olfactory systems. And those two systems generally go together. They're very closely related. So when we eat something, we often will smell it first to make sure that we like it. If it smells good, we're more likely to eat it. If it smells bad, it sends a warning signal to our brain that we might not like it or that it could be dangerous for us to eat. Our gustatory senses, as you probably guess, are located on our tongues, while our olfactory or our smell senses are located in our nose. So those are those 5 basic senses that we all know, but there are really 3 other sensory systems that are going to impact a child's development. And the first is the proprioceptive system. And proprioception is just a real fancy word for input from your muscles and joints. So that system allows us to know where our body parts are without having to look at them. So when you watch a young child learn how to walk, they're generally looking at their feet. If a kid is learning how to roller skate, they're looking at their feet, things like that, because they're getting that input from their muscles and joints about where their body parts are in space. When our system is intact, we don't have to know where our hands are moving, where our feet or legs are moving, because that system is intact. And then you've got your vestibular system. So the vestibular system is located in the inner ear, and it helps us to detect changes in gravity. So are we sitting? Are we standing? Are we upside down? Are we spinning? It's often referred to as the sort of the internal GPS system of the body. So it helps kids balance and to orient in space, so they're not running into walls or falling down. And all of that is affected by eye movement and balance, posture, muscle tone, attention. And then the final system I'm going to talk about is the interoceptive system. And interoception is really the idea of the physiological condition of our body. It helps us to understand and feel what's going on inside of our body. So it helps us to recognize if we're thirsty, if we are hungry, if our heart is racing. So that's important for kids when they're doing a lot of physical activity, to help us know, help the student know, help us know as adults, if there is a problem with our system, if we're getting overheated, or if we're not registering cold or something like that. So those are the 8 sensory systems that we're going to be kind of keeping in mind as we go through the sensory responses. So we've got this understanding of the different sensory systems. Now I'm going to talk about sensory responses. So the 8 that we talked about, all of those sensory systems have a hyper, a hypo, or an under type of response that you're going to see in your children. And you might notice all of the responses for the same sensory system, depending on the activity that's being done. So if it's a new experience versus something that the child has experienced before, you might see a different response. It's also very common to be hyper responsive in some of your sensory systems, and then hypo responsive or under responsive in other sensory systems. So remember, as I said, all of our sensory systems, they're not individual systems, they're all interconnected. And so our responses are going to be somewhat interconnected. So let's talk about our sensory avoiders, or our kids who are hyper responsive. These are kids who have this excessive response to sensory input. So they avoid more sensory input because it's overwhelming to their system. So generally what we're going to see behaviors that are either verbal, nonverbal, or physical that suggest that there are some hyper responses to the sensory systems. So if a child complains that it's too bright, too loud, too smelly, that is a good indication that that system is hyper responsive. So what that might look like, if your kid wants to be in the dark, they don't like the lights on, if they cover their ears when things get too noisy. You might see at home during dinner, everything is great, but if you have a large family gathering, Thanksgiving, a birthday party, you might see some different behaviors like screaming or hiding, withdrawing. In terms of our olfactory, that smell sense, your child might be overwhelmed by smells that others don't even notice or don't find unpleasant. And that can increase distractibility, can also cause some medical issues like nausea, upset stomach, headache, things like that. And obviously, I'm thinking about in the school setting, if a student is overwhelmed by something that they don't like the smell of, that's going to be hard to concentrate on what their teacher is saying. If you have something important going on at home and they are smelling something that they find unpleasant, it's going to be hard for them to attend to what you want them to do. It's also really important to remember that within the home setting and maybe even in the community, you might not see some of these behaviors because at home, there's likely less sensory input, right? Fewer kids, it's quieter. So your children's teachers may report seeing some of these behaviors. And it's important to really communicate and work together as a team to figure out, okay, it's not happening here, it's happening in this situation, what's going on? Because we want to get away from thinking about negative behavior as a kid being bad, but really it's about they are communicating something to us. And rather than thinking that it's a behavioral issue, we might think of it as a sensory issue and might want to look at addressing the sensory needs before we think about, well, we have to put this huge behavior plan in place, or they need a different type of setting, because sometimes if we can regulate that sensory system, we can mitigate some of those behaviors. So some additional behaviors that you might see with a student who, or a child who is hypersensitive, is that they might avoid eye contact, right? Like some of that visual input may be too much. They could become easily distracted by the visual or the auditory stimuli. So they can't filter out background noise. They're distracted, as I said, by other noises that others don't hear. Sometimes they are slow, and maybe you see this in the home setting. They seem to ignore or are slow to follow instructions. And that could be because rather than being defiant or disobedient, it could be that they are having a hard time filtering out what's important and what's not important in that auditory system. You might see some difficulties in group settings, so play dates, sports activities, and part of that, again, could be difficulty filtering out different voices. So if I'm a soccer player and I have my coach over here telling me something and the kids are screaming and the fans are screaming, it's going to be hard to filter out what I'm supposed to be doing. And so this is oftentimes when we see students or kiddos like picking blades of grass or just sitting down, sort of withdrawing from that activity. Same thing with family gatherings, large family gatherings, because it just may be too overwhelming. You might see some aggressive behavior in response to unexpected touch or unexpected sounds. And these are going to be kiddos who might have difficulty standing in line, sitting beside others. So if I think about church or other religious activities where they need to sit in groups, that may be more challenging for kiddos who are hypersensitive to touch or sound or any kind of visual input. Kids, you may also see some clothing sensitivity. So whether that could be tags or the fabric, the compression of something versus how loose it is. Kiddos who are hypersensitive, who have hypersensitive sensory systems, you might see that they have a very limited or a very rigid diet. And so there may be some concerns with being underweight. So something like the flavor may be too strong, the texture of the food, the color of the food, so that visual input may be challenging for them. And we'll talk about some strategies, but particularly when it comes to diet, again, you want to make sure that you're communicating closely with not only your physician, but the school nurse and the staff there, particularly if your child is eating anything at school, because we want to make sure, it's okay to have a limited diet and eat only certain things, but you want to make sure that your child's getting the appropriate nutrients that they need to grow. And then one of the other major behaviors or types of difficulties that we see are motion sickness, particularly from unpredictable movements, backward movement. So the swing sets, merry-go-rounds, I don't know that we really have merry-go-rounds anymore, but any kind of spinning activity is going to be more challenging. Activities that move up and down are generally easier on the system than activities that go back to front. And so really the best strategies to use for kids who have hyper responsive or over responsive sensory systems are those strategies that are going to calm that sensory system down. So let's talk about some strategies that we can use in the home, in the community. These are some things that maybe some of school personnel are using as well. And so this duration effect, let me talk about that for a moment. So for example, in the area of touch, calming strategies and then alerting strategies, which we'll talk about in just a minute, if done for about 10 to 15 minutes, they have an impact for about 90 minutes. So if I'm thinking about my child at going to church, and I know they're going to have to sit for a long period of time, and I know that that's challenging for them, I could think about doing 10 to 15 minutes of some tactile input and that's going to help them to remain seated, calmer for about 90 minutes. These other senses where it says affect only during input, generally there's not a lot of research that would suggest that there's any lasting effect after that strategy has been implemented, if that makes sense. So remember I said that sort of light touch or unexpected touch, that can alert the system, right? So that can create more response. Additional behaviors can be perceived as painful. And so that can result in physical aggression. And that's why that deep touch or that compression helps calm the system down. I do want to just make a comment because people can buy weighted blankets at Target and Walmart and all of those things. And you can go on Amazon and buy weighted vests and weighted, lap things. Any kind of weighted item for a child, that's very prescriptive. So things like weighted vests, those are measured by a child's body weight, etc. So if you're going to use a weighted blanket that you purchase in the store, if you go on Amazon and you buy something that can go over your child's lap, really the key to remember is that you want your child to be able to remove that item independently. That's why I would not recommend getting anything that has fasteners or buttons. If you're going to use something that's like a blanket or just something that goes over their lap that they can easily just push off. Anything with buttons or snaps, that may be more challenging if there's any kind of motor difficulty with the child. Things like smooth, silky, soft textures generally calm the system down. So things that I have used for kids in the community and at school are just small pieces of fabric that they can keep in their pocket or just hold in their hand that they can rub between their fingers that just gives some of that tactile input. And it's not noisy, it doesn't bother anybody. So if you need your child to sit for a while, that's something that they can hold onto. I had one kiddo who used to carry around cotton balls, and his mom would just keep tons of cotton balls in her bag that she could just hand to him. There are other things like seated cushions. So you could find on Amazon for $12 or $13 different types of seats that your kiddo can sit on. if they have a desk at home where they're doing homework, or at the dinner table, just to give some of that tactile input into their body as they're seated there, so that they can stay at the table with the family for dinner, or stay in the living room as you are watching a movie together as a family, etc. When you are thinking about activities that you want your child to engage in over the summer, so maybe you have them signed up for some different camps, etc. You want to think about, for those kids who are hypersensitive, maybe some non-contact activities. So things like swimming is a great activity because it can still be a team building type of thing, but there's no contact there. Other activities that you can do as a family are just taking walks, doing things like skipping and hopscotch, which helps that vestibular system, throwing and catching. Those are great activities to help build some of those social components without that contact. The idea is that we don't want our kids to avoid all of the things that may cause their system to be over responsive, because we want them to be fully functioning individuals within the community as much as they can be. And so the idea is to expose them, but to expose them systematically. So if there are behaviors that you're seeing because of the over responsiveness, then you can think about, how can I expose my child to something without creating some big behaviors? So you can do it in small increments, so that we've got some exposure, and then they know that, hey, I don't have to do this for a long period of time. So things like, and I think we'll talk about it in just a minute, using a visual timer. If you want your child to stay with the family at dinner time, but you know that that's normally a very challenging time, just set a timer, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever is working for your family. And then after that, then your child knows that they have a place that they can go to sort of calm, to get their system back in regulation. In terms of some auditory support, again, these are kids who have difficulty filtering out that background noise. So you want to minimize their distractions. If they have a spot at home where they're doing their homework, you want that place to be distraction-free. You may have a place where they can just unwind from school for a few minutes. And so there are things like just a calming corner or a cool down corner that you can create in your child's bedroom, or another corner in the home, where that might just be a place where there's a soft blanket or some of your child's favorite things. And that's a place where there are no expectations or no demands. It's a place where they can go for a few minutes to regulate themselves, because what we want is, we want a child to be able to recognize that they need to be able to regulate, and then remove themselves to use their strategies and then come back, versus having these big behaviors to communicate, hey, I have a problem. Using noise canceling headphones or earbuds, particularly if you have multiple kids in the house or lots of things going on. If your child is having a hard time sort of filtering that out, using those headphones or earbuds is a great way to help them be able to sort of get everything sort of focused for them. We've talked about that visual timer, those visual support, any kind of natural lighting. So it's nice to be near a window, that's that natural light, but you want to be careful that they're not getting the sensory input from outside. So traffic on the street, birds chirping, all of that. So it's kind of a fine line between kind of natural light. You can also dim the lights if you have that, use lamps instead of the overhead lights in that setting. White noise, so families sometimes buy noise machines, but you can also just turn on a ceiling fan that creates that nice white noise sound. Oftentimes in the classroom, teachers will use like instrumental music when students are doing independent work, and you could try something like that, classical music or other. I know there's lots of apps that have different sounds, like the Calm app, and there's a lot of free things on the Calm app that have different, so they have different sounds, but they also have, if anyone's used the Calm app, they have sort of like story time. And you can hear someone reading a story or just kind of going through this sort of meditation in these really nice voices. And that can be a great white noise, a use of white noise there. Okay. For this breaks during visual motor activities. So visual motor activities are, eye-hand coordination things. So building with blocks, writing, cutting, all of the sort of academic, pre-academic things. If you have a child who is a hypersensitive, visually, auditorily, you might want to consider giving a break after they do any type of like writing homework, because oftentimes what will happen is that because they're avoiding input, they're not putting any pressure on their pencil, and so writing is difficult for them. Building things, cutting things, any type of academic activity, you might want to consider giving them a break after they've done that task, just to help them regulate their system again. Okay, and then let's look at taste and smell. Oftentimes we think that sweet foods might alert our system or cause us to get a bit more amped up. But sweet foods increase the serotonin levels, and serotonin is that sort of good mood brain chemical, which decreases stress. So as adults, right, if we're stressed out, what do? We eat some chocolate, right? That's a sweet food that helps calm our system down. And I'm not advocating that you give your kids lots of chocolate, but you might want to think about things that are sort of naturally sweet. So sweet corn, melon, strawberries, any type of fruit. And that's also great if your child has some taste aversions. It's a great way to introduce some new foods to their diet. And refusal to eat certain foods or rigid diets, that can be attributed to lots of reasons. Could be the texture, it could be the smell. It's not necessarily tied to the specific taste or flavor, but it could be. If you are thinking about introducing some new foods to your child's diet, certainly talk with, again, your pediatrician, but also communicate with the school. There are activities within the school that maybe they're doing things with food. The one point that I would really stress is that if you are introducing new foods to your child, don't do that at meal times, right? We don't want to pair eating something that I don't like with mealtime, particularly for students who are already having a hard time eating, because that's just going to make mealtime more difficult. So it should happen at other times, because we don't want to increase anxiety. And we never want to coerce or force kiddos to try. I know growing up, I still to this day don't like peas. Growing up, we had to eat the number of our age, that number of peas. And my mother, God love her, that definitely not the best idea when you're trying to get kids to try new foods, right? There are lots of ways that you can incorporate or hide food in other foods. And I know maybe we can do this another time out there in Capel, but I did a whole cooking class with parents talking about different ways to hide food like cauliflower in, chocolate and brownies, etc. So there's lots of ways that you can hide new foods for your kids. That's why they make zoodles and spaghetti squash and things like that to taste and look like, pasta and starches. And the other part of that is have your child help with meal prep. That could be shopping, measuring, wiping, cleaning, pouring. Get them involved in that aspect of it. Kids who are involved are much more likely to try something that they have created. And then the smell piece of things, calming scents are great. At home, you can use diffusers or air fresheners. I do not recommend that when I'm talking with teachers, just because of the different needs of students. But you certainly can at home, if you know that your child is over responsive to certain smells, you can certainly use a calming scent as a diffuser. If you notice that your child has very strong reactions to scents, communicate that with your child's teachers. Things like strong perfumes or hand lotions can increase negative behavior, and your child's teachers may not even be aware that they are sort of a factor in some of those behaviors. And then you just want to consider some alternative materials, things like unscented markers, unscented Play-Doh, things like that, that you want to talk with the school about. Either they're providing that or you may be providing that for your child to use in the classroom, separate and apart. And if sometimes classrooms sort of do a whole group of, these are all the markers everybody has, and this is all the Play-Doh or whatever, but there just may need to be a separate unscented sort of group of things for students. And then before we move on to our sensory seekers, I want to talk just a minute about movement. So again, these are for kids who are hypersensitive. They may refuse to participate in activities or games because they dislike that sensation of the movement. So you might see this if you're taking a long car trip this summer. That may be very challenging for kids who have that sort of vestibular overload. Again, those weighted items can reduce motion sickness in a car. You want to, again, think about taking more breaks than you normally would so that they can move around and get out of the car a little bit. You also, things like dinner tables, oftentimes if a child's feet are off the ground, their vestibular system is dysregulated. So thinking about at the dinner table or the chair that the child is sitting in, if their feet aren't touching the ground, you may just want to consider putting something that fills that space in for them. So ensuring that the chairs are the right height so that their feet aren't dangling. We've talked about different activities. Oftentimes, if a student is over responsive to movement, they often prefer activities that are sedentary, reading, computer, video games. So you want to offer a variety of activities that just involve gentle movement. Again, walks, throwing and kicking a ball, gardening, things like that. Again, providing choice is always going to increase motivation and participation. All right, so those were our sensory avoiders, right? Now let's talk about kids who seek out a lot of sensory input, who are hypo-responsive, okay? These are kids who don't receive enough sensory input through the natural world, so they're constantly seeking it out. And these are kiddos who have a really hard time attending to any task, until they just get that right level of input or arousal. So some things that you might see for kids who are sensory seekers: they like bright, reflective, spinning objects and light, because that's increasing the amount of visual stimulation that they're getting, and it alerts their brain. These are kids who seek out additional sound. So they might hum or drum. And while this really does increase their alertness and really could help them focus, it's obviously distracting to others around them in the classroom. And if you have other children in the home as well. And certainly, you know, during COVID, hopefully we never have to go back to a time like that. But when parents were working from home and kids were doing school at home, we had a lot of students who were struggling with this aspect of it. These are really kids who don't register regular noises. And so they may not respond to others who are speaking, right? So you may ask them to do something and they, it looks like they're deliberately ignoring you, but really they're just not registering the sound. And really, if you're thinking about in the community, that could present a real danger. Thinking about parking lots or crossing streets in the neighborhood. If they aren't attuned to the sound because they're seeking out some other sensory input, you know, that could be very dangerous. These are your kiddos who are touchy-feely. They really can't seem to keep their hands to themselves, and they may unintentionally play rough, right? And could be in the school setting labeled as a bully or get into some additional discipline problems because of how they play. Conversely, they may not even recognize when they are touched or if their clothes are kind of cattywampus or askew. These are kids who complain about their hand hurting or about hating to write because oftentimes they are over gripping their writing utensil, right? Because they're seeking that pressure through the writing instrument, and that causes hand fatigue. We see kids who prefer very strong flavors, right? They're attempting to enhance that registration of taste. And we might even see kids who are eating non-food items, which is called pica, because they're seeking out texture. So they might eat rocks or pebbles because they're crunchy. They might eat Play-Doh because it's soft, etc. So you might see very strong preference for some smells or an underreaction to smells, right? Because they're not registering that smell. And again, just like not being able to register the sound, if they can't register or detect unpleasant tastes or smell sort of together, that gustatory and olfactory, could be very dangerous because you might have a child who ingests poison. So any kind of cleaning chemicals that you might have because they don't register those tastes and smells. These are also your kiddos who not only are they touchy, but they're fidgety. They have very difficult time staying seated, and it's very hard for them to attend and focus if they have to sit for a long period of time. So they seek lots of movement to increase that alertness. And while it does really increase attention, right? If we're working and we're tired at our desk, we get up and take a walk. That's to get that movement to increase our alertness. So when a child is forced to sit still or stay seated, we may inadvertently be causing negative behaviors because they're needing that movement to regulate their system. So the best strategies that we use for students who exhibit sensory seeking behavior are alerting or stimulating activities. And our instinct is to say, well, if they're seeking out all this sensory input, really we should be calming their system. But we want to be strategic about it. We want to, their system needs that input. We want to be strategic about how we provide that input so that then they can do the things that we need them to do, whether that's at home or at school. And before we get to the strategies, I want to talk about under-responders because the strategies are very similar. So our under-responders, these are kiddos who have a diminished or a response to sensory input. So way more sensory input is needed than your average in order to get any type of response. So these are kids who have been described as just bumps on logs. They're generally needy, but tend to be helpless to have their needs met effectively. They don't know how to do that. And they can be described as lazy by those who aren't recognizing that these are sensory under responders, and are often described as looking tired or being tired within the classroom setting. So just like our sensory seekers, under responders are going to need those alerting or stimulating activities. So going back to sort of that chart that we use for our calming, we'll look at them in the same way for alerting. So again, texture is really great, but instead of those soft, silky textures, which are calming, we're going to look at things that are fuzzy or sticky or rough. So think about Velcro, things that stretch. So for example, like I've got two fidgets here, right? Again, I can carry both these, right? They're the same thing, but one is smooth, and then this one has a little bit more texture, right? So I want to be thinking about, okay, is my child hypersensitive? I might use this type of sensory toy or fidget. Or are they hypo, or do I need to alert them? So I want to give them something with a little more texture. For things like weight-bearing activities, so working on the floor rather than sitting at a desk or a table can be helpful. So just getting that input from the floor to their feet and legs and stomach can help regulate that system. They can also, for older kids, use something like a hand gripper. So I don't know, athletes kind of use that to strengthen their hands. So if a kid is doing some homework, they can have a hand gripper in the left if they're right-handed, or vice versa. And that can give some input into that hand. Using for writing activities, you can add a little weight to your pencil. So like sometimes your pencil can have, you can add a little grip to your pencil, and that can give a little bit of extra weight, or you can add something to the top of a pen or a pencil, and that gives it a little bit of extra weight. Experimenting with different types of writing utensils. So having a student use a felt tip pen rather than a regular pen or pencil, because you know a marker or a felt tip pen, if you put too much pressure, it's going to go through the paper. So that's helping your child learn what kind of pressure that they need to use on the paper. It helps with that hand fatigue. For our auditory supports, you want to use your child's name. It sounds silly, even if they're the only one in the room, but anytime we hear our name, that's going to alert our system. So if you really need to get your child's attention, you want to say, Sarah, please go get your shoes from the closet. We're leaving. Something like that. Use their name. Students who are seeking out additional noise, again, headphones might be appropriate for them to be able to listen to music or any type of white noise, meditation noise, to help them when they're working. Loud environments, fast music, oftentimes, again, whether I worked in classrooms or I was working with families in the home, if prior to any type of task that the student thought was challenging, we might have a dance break where we just do 1 or 2 minutes of really fast, energetic dancing. They get to choose the song. That's very motivating for them. And then we do a task, and then we might do another dance break afterward where they get to, again, pick the song just to get some of that auditory input, some of that movement, and then we can do a task, particularly those tasks that seem challenging to the student. We want to think about using brighter colors. Again, that just draws that visual system, right? It draws the eye to something bright. But you want to be careful again about, you want to make sure that you keep the main thing. So you want to keep your child attentive to the most important information and not be distracted by what's going on around them. So, you don't want to paint your child's room bright pink because that may be overstimulating, but you might have some pink overlays or something pink on the wall or something purple on the wall, whatever their favorite color is, but just making it nice and bright for them. In terms of taste, again, particularly if your child is eating non-food items, you want to think about what can provide that same type of texture. So things that are crunchy, chewy, spicy, any type of that very strong flavor is going to alert those gustatory senses. Using an electric toothbrush gives a great amount of input into the mouth early on. So first thing in the morning, they can get some of that gustatory input. And then gum is a great tool to use out in the community. If you're going to be at a location for a long time, it just gives, again, some of that input. And that's a very typical thing. You see lots of kids chewing gum versus chewing on their shirt or their arm, their fingernails, things like that. That gum is a very typical activity. And then our smell, those alerting senses or alerting scents, again, different than the calming sense. But if you're going to do family games, you might think about going outside and sitting in the grass, right? So getting that smell of the grass, gardening, any type of scented objects like soaps and lotions, markers or stickers, if you're doing any type of sticker chart with your children. And then let me just say a quick thing about movement, right? So again, these are kiddos who often seek a lot of movement to increase their alertness. So just like we talked about that, like a seated cushion that could calm the system, a seated cushion could actually also alert a system. So you don't have to have lots of different things for different aspects. You can use the same cushion to help alert or to calm the system. Classroom chores and or home chores and exercises, which we'll talk about in just a minute, are great things. If you're gonna do movement breaks at home, systematic movement breaks, you want to think about, okay, when are those breaks going to occur? Where will that break occur? How long will the break be? Particularly if your child needs a very similar structure from school to home, and you're thinking about, okay, I need to keep my child very structured throughout the summer months so that they don't get dysregulated before they go back to school. And we're going to talk about some structured sort of playground activities, skipping, hopscotch, relay races with siblings or neighborhood friends. All of those are great activities. I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but I do want to just quickly talk about proprioceptive inputs. Because proprioceptive, again, remember, that's that system that sort of tells our bodies where they are in space. It's that input from muscles and joints. And proprioceptive inputs are fantastic because for kiddos who are overreactive or prone to sensory overload, this heavy work or proprioceptive activities calm the system, right? Decrease stress. But for those who need input, it can alert our systems, right? It helps to increase attention to task for those who might be otherwise under responsive. So generally, any activity that involves pushing, pulling, carrying, weight bearing are considered proprioceptive activities. So I won't read all of these to you, but I have linked a couple of different types of animal walks. These are really fun family activities to do, races. Kids love to see their parents and their siblings act silly, but it does really give a lot of proprioceptive input. I'm not going to talk about the brain. Just know that there is a lot of brain research out there that indicates that movement and exercise and different types of movement and exercise really do build brain activity. And so particularly for those kiddos who are under responsive and who seek out sedentary activities, we want to make sure that we are getting that movement and exercise in to get those neurons and synapses firing. And then this isn't necessarily the right crowd because you all are here. But oftentimes I'm asked, well, why do we have to do this? But honestly, every single one of us needs sensory breaks. We want to be mindful of what are the behaviors that we're seeing that could suggest that a child needs a sensory break versus this kid is being bad. It's really more about that sensory support that we want to provide. We want to be systematic. So we want to think about when we want to provide those sensory breaks and why we're utilizing the sensory break. We don't want to just throw, some headphones on a kid. We want to think about, okay, what is their behavior telling us? Is it under responsive or over responsive? Are they hypersensitive, hyposensitive? And then the other thing is sensory breaks can be done everywhere. You don't need a sensory room for all of that. It can be done at home, within the community, outside, in the classroom. It can be done in every setting. So